It seemed like an ordinary day at the bustling stadium entrance. The air was alive with excitement as fans decked out in colorful jerseys poured in from every direction. The rhythmic buzz of their chatter mixed with the occasional honk of cars outside created a symphony of anticipation. Everyone was eager to witness the evening's grand match, a clash of titans on the field, starring the one and only Lionel Messi. Amid the chaos, Carlos, the veteran security guard, stood firm at his post. With years of experience etched into his stern face, he took his job seriously. His keen eyes swept across the crowd, trained to catch the smallest sign of trouble. He had dealt with it all: counterfeit tickets, unruly fans, and even clever tricks from kids desperate to sneak in for a glimpse of their heroes. As he stood scanning the crowd, something unusual caught his attention. Among the sea of colorful jerseys and excited faces, a young boy stood out. He was small, scrappy, and clearly out of place. His clothes were tattered, his sneakers worn down to their soles, and he clutched a faded soccer ball as though it were his most prized possession. The boy's head barely reached Carlos's chest, but his presence demanded notice. There was something in his eyes, a spark of determination that seemed too big for his small frame. Carlos watched as the boy hesitated near the entrance, shifting nervously on his feet. His movements were tentative, almost as if he were afraid to step closer. The crowd bustled around him, people rushing past without giving him a second glance. Yet, the boy remained, gripping his soccer ball tightly as if it was the only thing anchoring him to this chaotic world. "Ticket!" Carlos called out, his voice firm but not unkind. He stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the boy. It wasn't the first time he'd dealt with someone like this. Kids without tickets trying their luck were a common sight. Some came with bold excuses, others with teary pleas. But this boy, he was different. He didn't move or speak immediately. Instead, he froze, his wide eyes meeting Carlos's. The boy swallowed hard, fumbling in his pocket as though searching for something. Carlos watched him closely. The hesitation, the anxious glances, these were signs he had seen many times before. Finally, the boy's small hands stopped moving, and he looked up at Carlos. His silence spoke volumes. "You don't have a ticket, do you?" Carlos said, his tone firm but now tinged with a hint of disappointment. The boy shook his head slowly, his grip tightening on the soccer ball. His lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. Carlos sighed, glancing at the crowd that continued to stream in. He was used to this kind of thing, but there was something about this boy that made him pause. It wasn't just his shabby appearance, it was the way he carried himself, the quiet strength in his posture despite his obvious vulnerability. Carlos felt a tug of sympathy but quickly reminded himself of his duty. Rules were rules, after all. "You can't stay here, kid," Carlos said, his voice softening slightly. "No ticket, no entry. That's the rule." The boy looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of pleading and defiance. "Please, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to see the match. Just for a little while. I only want to see Messi play." Carlos frowned. He had heard Messi's name countless times from fans who would do anything to catch a glimpse of their idol. But there was something different about the way this boy said it. His words weren't just about admiration, they were laced with longing, as though seeing Messi wasn't just a dream but a desperate need. Carlos opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a movement in the shadows nearby caught his attention. He turned his head slightly, scanning the area. For a moment, he thought he saw someone, a figure partially obscured by the crowd. The person was holding something, and as Carlos squinted, he realized it was a camera. The lens was pointed directly at the scene unfolding before him. Carlos's brow furrowed. Was someone filming this? He straightened, his posture becoming more rigid. He didn't have time to worry about curious onlookers, his focus needed to stay on the boy in front of him. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling at the back of his neck. "Kid," Carlos said, redirecting his attention. "I get it. But rules are rules. You need to move along." The boy's face fell, but he didn't argue. Instead, he took a step back, clutching his soccer ball tighter. His movements were slow, almost reluctant, as though each step away from the entrance was tearing him apart inside. Carlos watched him for a moment longer, an unexpected pang of guilt surfacing. But he shook it off. He had a job to do, and he couldn't make exceptions, no matter how much the boy's determination tugged at him. Unbeknownst to either of them, the figure in the shadows continued to watch. The camera's lens focused on the boy's every move, capturing the way he hesitated, the way his fingers gripped the ball like a lifeline. Behind the camera, a pair of eyes narrowed with interest. A quiet chuckle broke the silence. "Interesting," the person murmured, their voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Without revealing themselves, they adjusted the camera, ensuring they didn't miss a single moment of what was unfolding. And so, while the bustling stadium continued its rhythm, while fans streamed inside to witness the magic of Messi, a small story was quietly being recorded in the background, a story of a boy with nothing but a dream, a soccer ball, and a determination that refused to be ignored. What neither Carlos nor Mateo could have guessed was that this moment was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could imagine. Carlos sighed as he returned to scanning the crowd. The boy's retreating figure lingered in the corner of his vision, a small silhouette against the sea of bustling fans. People brushed past Mateo without a second glance, their laughter and shouts drowning out his silent disappointment. Yet, the boy didn't move far. He hovered near a trash bin, holding his soccer ball close as though it were his only friend in the world. Carlos found his gaze drifting back to him despite himself. He had seen desperation in many forms over the years: teary-eyed kids, slick con artists, even furious fans trying to shove their way past security. But this kid was different. He wasn't angry, and he wasn't scheming. There was a quiet resolve about him, like he wasn't just here for fun or mischief. "Carlos," a voice called from the nearby gate. It was Juan, another security guard. Older than Carlos, Juan had a booming voice and a no-nonsense attitude. He waved Carlos over. "Quit staring off into space, man. You'll miss the real trouble." Carlos gave a quick nod but didn't immediately respond. His eyes flicked back to Mateo. The boy had stopped pacing and was now bouncing the ball lightly against the pavement, each soft thud swallowed by the roar of the crowd. His movements were precise, his control over the ball impressive for someone his age. It was as if the chaos around him didn't exist. "Hey, Carlos." One's voice came again, sharper this time. Yeah, I'm coming," Carlos muttered, tearing his eyes away from the boy. He turned and walked toward the gate where Juan was stationed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something unusual. Meanwhile, Mateo continued bouncing his ball, his mind racing with thoughts. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He had come too far to stop now. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the ball tighter. He had spent weeks saving up just to make this trip, cleaning shoes, running errands, anything to earn a few coins. But even after all his efforts, he couldn't afford a ticket. Still, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Somewhere inside that massive stadium, Lionel Messi, his hero, was warming up for the match. The thought alone sent a rush of energy through him. Mateo had watched Messi's games on a tiny television at the corner shop in his neighborhood. Every time the screen flickered with Messi's movements, Mateo felt like he was watching magic. For as long as he could remember, soccer had been his escape. On the dusty streets of his small town, with nothing but an old ball and makeshift goals, Mateo had practiced for hours every day. He didn't just play, he dreamed. He dreamed of standing on a field like the one behind the gates in front of him. He dreamed of hearing the roar of a crowd, of feeling the grass beneath his feet as he scored the winning goal. But dreams, he had learned, didn't always come easy. Back at the gate, Carlos tried to shake the unease gnawing at him. "What's got you so distracted today?" Juan asked as Carlos joined him. "Nothing," Carlos replied curtly, though his tone lacked conviction. Juan raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? I saw you staring at that kid over there. What's his deal?" Carlos shrugged, not wanting to admit that the boy had gotten under his skin. "Just another kid trying to sneak in," he said, keeping his tone casual. Juan chuckled. "Yeah, happens all the time. Kids think just because they're cute, they can get away with anything." Carlos didn't respond. Instead, he glanced back toward where the boy had been standing. Mateo was still there, bouncing the ball with a quiet focus. "Doesn't look like he's leaving," Juan said, following Carlos's gaze. "You want me to handle it?" "No," Carlos said quickly. He didn't know why, but the thought of someone else dealing with the boy didn't sit right with him. "He's not causing any trouble. Let him be." Juan gave Carlos a questioning look but didn't press the matter. "Suit yourself. Just don't let the boss catch you going soft." As the minutes passed, the crowd around the stadium grew thicker. Vendors shouted, selling snacks and souvenirs. Children laughed and tugged on their parents' hands, eager to get inside. The atmosphere was electric, but for Mateo, it felt like the world was moving in slow motion. He stared at the towering gates, his mind racing for a solution. How could he get inside? He had tried to ask nicely, but that hadn't worked. Sneaking in seemed impossible with the security guards watching everything so closely. "Come on, Mateo," he muttered to himself. "Think." Then, as if by instinct, he glanced toward a side entrance where a group of delivery workers was unloading crates of bottled water. The gate there was slightly ajar, the guards distracted as they checked paperwork. Mateo's heart raced. Could he make it through without being noticed? But before he could take a step, a hand landed on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see Carlos standing behind him, his expression unreadable. "You're not thinking about doing something stupid, are you?" Carlos asked, his voice low but firm. Mateo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Carlos sighed, crouching slightly so he was eye level with the boy. "Look, kid, I know you want to get inside. But that's not the way to do it." Mateo looked down, ashamed. I just want to see Messi," he whispered. Carlos studied the boy's face for a moment. There was no malice, no mischief, just pure, unfiltered longing. For the first time in a long time, Carlos felt torn. "Wait here," Carlos said finally, straightening up. "What?" Mateo asked, his voice tinged with surprise and hope. "Just stay put," Carlos repeated. Then, without another word, he walked away. From the shadows, the mysterious figure with the camera continued filming, a small smile playing on their lips. They had been observing the entire interaction, intrigued by both the boy's determination and the guard's unexpected change of heart. "Let's see where this goes," the figure murmured, adjusting the focus on the camera. Carlos returned a few minutes later, holding something in his hand. Mateo's eyes widened as he saw the small piece of paper, a visitor pass. "This doesn't get you to the stands," Carlos said gruffly, handing it to the boy. "But it'll get you into the outer section where you can watch on the screens." "That's the best I can do." Mateo stared at the pass, his hands trembling as he took it. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. Carlos nodded, his expression unreadable. "Don't make me regret this, kid." As Mateo walked toward the entrance, clutching the pass like it was a golden ticket, the figure in the shadows lowered their camera, a satisfied look on their face. Little did Carlos or Mateo know, this small act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. Mateo stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart racing, his hands clenched tightly around the faded soccer ball he carried. He had come so far, traveled miles from his small, cramped neighborhood to this grand, towering stadium, where heroes were made and dreams came true. But standing before the security guard, he realized the harsh truth: he wasn't going to get in. Not without a ticket. I don't have a ticket, Mateo stammered, his voice small but desperate. His face flushed with embarrassment as he tried to find the right words. But please, I just want to see the match. Just 5 minutes. His eyes shone with the kind of sincerity that only a kid in his position could muster, someone who had given everything to make it this far, and yet still found the world pushing back. Carlos, the security guard, looked down at him with a mix of sympathy and professional detachment. He had seen this before too many times. The pleading looks, the excuses, the desperate dreams. He had been doing this job long enough to know the rules, and he followed them without exception. He didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. Rules are rules, kid, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. You can't just waltz in because you want to. His tone left no room for negotiation. The crowd behind him surged forward, their own lives continuing on without a second glance at Mateo, but Carlos's focus remained unwavering on the boy. The boy's face dropped, a deep sadness spreading across it like a dark cloud. His eyes flickered for a moment briefly, he seemed like he might argue, might say something that could change Carlos's mind, but instead, he just stood there, shoulders slumped, defeated. His dream felt so close, yet it seemed as though it was slipping away with every passing second. Please, sir, Mateo whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. I only want to watch Messi play, just once. There was a quiet desperation in his voice that spoke volumes. Messi wasn't just a player to him, he was a symbol of everything Mateo had ever dreamed of. To see him play, just once, would make all the struggles, the sacrifices, worth it. For Mateo, it wasn't just a game, it was a moment that could change everything. Carlos's eyes softened for a moment, but only for a moment. He had heard this story before, too many times. Kids with big dreams and little means, trying to find a way into a world that didn't want them. But the reality was harsh, and Carlos knew that all too well. You can't stay here, kid, he said, a little gentler now, but still firm. Not without a ticket. The crowd didn't stop. They pushed past Mateo, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding on the sidelines. Some walked by without a second glance, some sneered at the boy's ragged appearance, but none of them saw him. None of them saw his determination, his passion. For them, he was just another face in the crowd. But Carlos wasn't just watching the crowd, he was watching Mateo. The boy's fingers gripped the soccer ball so tightly that his knuckles whitened. His face was a mix of defeat and determination. Mateo wasn't giving up, not yet. He wasn't walking away quietly. Carlos, for a moment, felt a twinge of sympathy. He had been in that position once, as a young man with dreams too big for his life. He knew what it was like to want something so badly, something that seemed out of reach. But reality was a cold, hard thing, and it had a way of slapping you back into your place when you dared to dream too big. The boy stood still, unmoving, as the crowd surged past him. It was as though Mateo was caught in a separate world, a world where he wasn't just a kid with no ticket, but someone with something bigger inside him, something that wouldn't let him just walk away. His small frame seemed to shrink further into itself as the other fans marched forward, oblivious to his existence. Some muttered under their breath, casting judgmental looks at him. Get lost, kid, one man sneered as he shoved past. You're not getting in without a ticket, another voice yelled from the crowd, but it was dismissive, as if Matteo was no more than an annoyance. Matteo flinched but didn't move. He didn't know how to explain to these people that this wasn't just a game. This was everything. He was just a boy, standing in the shadow of the greatest footballer in the world, and he couldn't even be close enough to see him. The ache inside him was palpable, but his resolve was even stronger. Behind him, unnoticed by Matteo, a camera continued rolling, capturing every moment in silence. The person behind it watched closely, a small smile creeping across their face as they observed the unfolding drama. The camera lens zoomed in slightly, focusing on Matteo's clenched fists and his determined stance. The quiet chuckle from behind the camera broke the silence. "Interesting," the voice behind the camera murmured softly, as though speaking to no one but themselves. Carlos didn't know it, but his interactions with Matteo weren't just being witnessed by the crowd. There was someone else watching, someone with a clear view of the small drama unfolding at the edge of the stadium. Whoever it was, they weren't concerned with the rules or the strict enforcement of order, they were interested in something else entirely. The voice behind the camera was calm, curious, and perhaps even entertained. They had seen many things in their line of work, but something about this moment stood out. It wasn't the desperation in the boy's eyes that was intriguing, it was the fire, the spark of something much deeper, much more resilient than the usual desperation they had seen in the past. This boy wasn't going to walk away quietly. There was something special about him. Meanwhile, Carlos was growing increasingly frustrated. He was used to following protocol, to maintaining order. It was his job, his duty. And when it came to his job, Carlos was unyielding. He had seen it all: people trying to bribe their way in, people who tried to sneak in under the radar, and countless others who found ways to justify breaking the rules. But Matteo was different. Carlos couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about the boy made him hesitate. Carlos looked at him one more time, and his thoughts swirled. He should have told the boy to leave, to stop wasting time. He should have turned him away. The rules were the rules, after all. But as he stared at Matteo's eyes, full of raw hope and silent determination, Carlos felt something stir inside him. The crowd was still moving around them, oblivious to this small, fragile moment of connection. Carlos's gaze softened, just for a moment. But then he turned away, shaking his head. It wasn't his place to make exceptions. He had seen enough heartache in his life to know that dreams didn't always come true, no matter how hard you wished. But as he walked away, something in the back of his mind nagged at him, a small, growing discomfort. It wasn't just the boy's eyes that stayed with him, it was the deep, unwavering focus in Matteo's posture. The way he refused to give up. The camera continued rolling, capturing every step of the story. And still, Matteo stood there, gripping his ball tightly, not ready to let go of his dream. Unbeknownst to Carlos, the real story, the one that would unfold in ways none of them could have predicted, had already begun. As Matteo stood there, the world around him seemed to blur. The sound of the crowd, the roar of excitement from inside the stadium, the footsteps of hurried fans, all of it felt distant. His gaze was fixed on the large screen near the entrance, where glimpses of players warming up flickered. Messi. The great Lionel Messi. His every move on the field was an inspiration, a reminder of what could be achieved with enough skill and determination. Matteo wasn't just a fan, he was a dreamer, someone who wanted to be where those players were. In his heart, he believed that one day, with enough effort, he could make it. He didn't care about the rules or the crowd, all that mattered was his passion for the game. The ball felt like an extension of himself as his feet moved with precision, dribbling it in tight circles, weaving through invisible defenders. In this quiet space at the edge of the stadium, Matteo was a professional. He was no longer a boy trying to get in to see a game; in his mind, he was playing in it. Carlos, who had initially dismissed him, was now looking back from the corner of his eye. The guard was busy scanning the crowd, his job to maintain order, but he couldn't help but notice Matteo again. The boy was different from the usual fans he saw. Carlos had been doing this job long enough to know that most kids, especially the ones who didn't have tickets, were either too distracted by the spectacle or too disappointed to stick around. But Matteo wasn't like the others. The boy was focused, intent on perfecting his dribble as though nothing else mattered. He didn't seem to care that he was standing in the corner, hidden behind the crowd. His whole attention was on the game he wasn't allowed to play, at least, not yet. Carlos couldn't help but feel a little tug of something, sympathy, perhaps. It reminded him of his younger self, when he had been full of dreams, playing on dusty fields with friends, imagining he was on the world's biggest stage. But that had been a long time ago. Life had a way of squashing those kinds of dreams. Reality had a way of kicking down the door and taking everything you once held dear. "Hey, kid," Carlos called out again, his voice louder this time, trying to break through Matteo's focus. The boy didn't respond at first. Carlos tried again, this time stepping closer. "I said, hey." Matteo didn't look up immediately. But then, as if slowly pulled from his own world, he glanced toward the guard. His eyes were wide and apologetic, like a child caught doing something wrong. Carlos couldn't help but feel that twinge of guilt again. The boy wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't trying to sneak in or cause a scene. He was just there, wanting something more than life had given him. Carlos could see that in his eyes. "Don't make me tell you again," Carlos said more firmly, though there was no malice in his voice. He wasn't trying to make the boy feel worse, but he couldn't bend the rules, not even for someone like Matteo. Matteo bit his lip and nodded. His face fell again, and he took a step back, like a puppy that had been scolded too many times. But instead of walking away, he just stood there. His eyes shifted toward the stadium entrance. The match was about to start. Messi would be stepping onto the field soon, and Matteo wouldn't be there to witness it. For a moment, Carlos felt like he might offer a concession, might let the boy stay for a little while, but he quickly dismissed the thought. No exceptions. That was the rule. Just as he started to turn back to the entrance, a voice interrupted. It was soft but confident, cutting through the tension between the boy and the guard. "Let him stay." Carlos's head snapped toward the source of the voice. A man in a hoodie, sunglasses hiding most of his face, was standing a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. He didn't seem to be in any particular rush, and his presence made Carlos pause. Something about the man felt different. He didn't seem like one of the typical fans, no cheering or excitement in his demeanor. He was calm, almost too calm for someone standing so close to a bustling stadium. "What's it to you?" Carlos asked, his voice still firm but laced with a touch of suspicion. The sudden appearance of the man had caught him off guard, and his instincts were on high alert. The man shrugged, pulling his hoodie a little tighter over his head. "He's not causing any trouble. Let him play for a while. What's the harm?" Carlos studied the man for a moment. He had an almost too casual attitude, as if he wasn't fazed by anything around him. And yet, Carlos felt something was off. But in the end, what could he do? The boy wasn't breaking the rules, he was just trying to watch the game. For a moment, Carlos considered telling the stranger to mind his business. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step back and looked at Matteo again. "All right, you've got 5 minutes, Carlos muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "But that's it? Don't make me regret this." Matteo's face lit up with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. He couldn't believe it. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickly positioned himself in the corner, eyes still glued to the screen. He didn't care about anything else anymore. He had been given this chance, this tiny, fragile window, and he wasn't going to waste it. The man in the hoodie watched for a moment longer, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, melting away as quickly as he had arrived. Matteo didn't notice. He was too focused on the game unfolding on the screen, on Messi's every move. Carlos, still hovering nearby, watched him for a while. Matteo's movements were so fluid, so precise, that it was hard not to be impressed. The boy was more than just a fan, he was a player in his own right. Even if he was just practicing in a corner, with no audience but himself, his passion was undeniable. His focus was unwavering. Carlos couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration, even if he didn't show it. But just as quickly as the admiration came, it faded. Carlos reminded himself that this wasn't his problem. He had a job to do. The rules had to be followed. The crowd was getting rowdy, and it was time for him to get back to work. With one last look at the boy, Carlos turned and moved back into the flow of the crowd. But Matteo didn't notice. He was too absorbed in the game, his feet moving as though he were already on the field, his eyes shining with the hope of someday being there for real. In the shadows, the camera continued to roll. The person behind it was still watching. They had seen enough of the boy's determination to know there was something more at play here, something bigger than just a kid trying to get into a soccer match. Matteo wasn't just another fan. There was a fire inside him, a desire to prove himself that was undeniable. As the minutes passed, the camera shifted slightly, zooming in on Matteo's intense focus. The voice behind the lens spoke again, this time with a hint of amusement. "This is going to be interesting." It wasn't just a game anymore. It wasn't about Messi or the stadium or even the match. It was about something else entirely, something that was just beginning to unfold. The camera was recording, and the story was being written, though no one could have predicted how it would end. Matteo remained in the same spot near the entrance, barely noticing the people around him as he continued to practice his dribbling. His feet moved with smooth precision, every touch of the ball controlled and deliberate. He was in his own world, where nothing mattered but the game. Every flick of the ball and every step he took felt like part of his dream coming true. His hands were steady, even though his heart raced with excitement. He could almost see himself on the field, playing with his idols, wearing the same jersey as Messi, moving with the same grace and skill. But for now, he was just a boy standing in the shadows, trying to make the best of a small moment in time. His worn-out shoes, his tattered clothes, none of that mattered in this moment. All that mattered was the ball and the feeling of being connected to something greater than himself. Carlos, the security guard, had noticed Matteo again. He had been busy with the growing crowd but couldn't ignore the boy any longer. There was something about him, something that stood out even among the bustling mass of fans. He was a kid, sure, but the way he moved with the ball was impressive. It wasn't like any other fan Carlos had seen standing at the entrance. This kid had real talent, even if it was only in the way he handled a soccer ball. Carlos approached him again, his steps heavy with authority. "Kid, I told you already. You're not supposed to be here. Go home. This is for ticket holders, not for..." But before Carlos could finish his sentence, a voice interrupted him, cutting through the air with calm authority. "Let him stay." Carlos stopped dead in his tracks. The voice came from behind him, and he turned, startled by the interruption. Standing nearby, just a few feet away, was a man in a hoodie and sunglasses. The man's posture was relaxed, but there was something about the way he watched Matteo with quiet amusement that made Carlos uneasy. Carlos squinted at the man. "What's it to you?" he asked, his tone defensive. He was trying to figure out who the stranger was and why he was getting involved in something that wasn't his business. Security guards didn't like it when people started questioning their authority, and Carlos felt like his position was being undermined. The man shrugged slightly, adjusting his hoodie as he casually looked back at Matteo. "He's not causing trouble." Let him play. The stranger's voice was calm, almost disinterested, but there was a subtle command in his words. He didn't seem worried about the rules or the usual order of things. Carlos studied the man carefully, his suspicion growing. There was something familiar about him, though Carlos couldn't place it. The sunglasses hid most of his face, and the hoodie pulled low over his head made it hard to see much else. But something about his demeanor made Carlos feel uneasy. It wasn't just the way he had intervened, it was the way he carried himself. Like he knew more than he was letting on. Carlos glanced back at Mateo. The boy had paused his dribbling for a moment, but his focus hadn't wavered. His eyes were still locked on the screen showing the warm-up session, where the players were getting ready for the match. Carlos felt a twinge of frustration. The kid had no ticket, no right to be here, and yet he was staying, unwilling to leave. Why couldn't he just go home like everyone else? The man in the hoodie seemed to notice the frustration in Carlos's eyes. "You're not going to get anywhere by kicking him out," the man said, his voice still calm. "He's not causing any harm. Just let him stay for a while." Carlos felt the tension rising within him. He didn't like being told what to do, especially by someone who wasn't even a part of the security team. "I've got a job to do," Carlos replied sharply, his voice low but firm. "And that job is to keep the rules. He's not supposed to be here." The man's gaze lingered on Mateo for a moment longer before he spoke again. "And what's the harm in letting him watch for a few minutes? You've seen the kind of crowd we're dealing with today. What difference will it make if one kid is standing off to the side?" Carlos opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The man was right in one sense, the crowd was chaotic, and people were everywhere, jostling and shouting in excitement. Mateo wasn't causing any problems. He was just standing there, practicing his skills, lost in his own little world. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to let him stay for a few minutes. But Carlos's job wasn't just about what seemed right in the moment. He had to follow the rules. If he allowed one kid to slip through, what would that mean for the rest of the crowd? He couldn't make exceptions. Still, the voice inside him that had once been a dreamer, that young man who had once played soccer for fun before life got in the way, couldn't entirely suppress the feeling of sympathy for Mateo. The boy wasn't asking for much. He just wanted to see the game. To feel close to the thing he loved. Carlos looked at the man again. The stranger's face was still hidden, but there was an air of authority about him that made Carlos hesitate. Something about the way he stood casual, but still commanding made him wonder if he had seen this man before. Perhaps it was just the way he carried himself, like someone who was used to getting his way without needing to raise his voice. But no. It couldn't be. The man was just another fan, right? Carlos finally sighed, his shoulders drooping a little. "Fine," he muttered. 5 minutes. But that's it? Then he's gone. The man in the hoodie nodded, the faintest hint of a smile on his face. "Thank you," he said, though his tone didn't seem particularly grateful. It was more of a statement, like he had expected Carlos to cave in all along. Carlos turned away and began to walk back into the crowd, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about this whole situation that didn't sit right with him. He had granted the boy a small favor, sure, but what was it really going to change? It was just a few minutes, after all. But why had that man intervened? Why did he care so much about a kid with no ticket? The thoughts swirled in Carlos's mind, but he pushed them aside. He had a job to do, and there were plenty of other people to keep an eye on. As he moved through the crowd, his attention returned to the task at hand. The stadium was filling up, and he couldn't afford to get distracted. Meanwhile, Mateo stood in the corner, his heart racing with excitement. His dream was within reach, even if just for a moment. His eyes were still glued to the screen, watching Messi warm up, seeing him dribble and move with the kind of grace Matteo could only dream of. In that moment, it felt like he was on the field too, his own body moving with the same rhythm as the pros. The minutes ticked by, but Matteo barely noticed. His feet continued to work with the ball, his focus sharper than ever. For those few precious minutes, he was no longer a kid standing in the shadows, he was a part of the game, a part of the dream. The stranger watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He had seen enough. The kid had a fire inside him, a passion that couldn't be ignored. And while Matteo didn't yet know it, his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The camera continued rolling in the shadows, capturing every moment, every movement. The person behind the lens was watching closely, seeing the potential in the boy, knowing that this small moment was just the beginning. The story was far from over. As the minutes passed, Matteo's excitement only grew. He continued to dribble in the narrow space, each movement a reflection of the dream that burned inside him. His feet had become a blur as he weaved the ball through imaginary defenders, imagining the roar of the crowd with every successful move. His mind, for a brief moment, allowed him to forget the harsh reality of his situation. The torn shoes, the empty pockets, the tired eyes, none of that mattered right now. In his mind, he was on the field, playing with the best. Carlos, though, had never stopped watching him. He kept his distance, trying to stay focused on his duties. But there was something about the boy's passion, the way he moved with the ball, that made it hard to ignore. In a different time, in a different life, Carlos might have been one of those kids himself. He had played soccer when he was younger, before the responsibility of life had stolen those carefree days away. He turned his attention back to the crowd, watching the people filter into the stadium. They were all excited, all expecting the game to be something special. But for Carlos, it was just another day. He was used to the chaos. He was used to the fans pushing and shoving, the constant noise, the distractions. This was his world now, and he had learned to shut out the noise. But the boy. Matteo's quiet determination was like a whisper in the midst of all the chaos, a reminder of what it meant to dream. Carlos found himself glancing back at Matteo again. There was something about the way he practiced, the way his movements flowed so naturally. He wasn't just a fan, he was a player. Carlos could see that. As the minutes ticked by, Matteo was no longer just a kid practicing by the entrance. He was completely immersed in his own world. Every touch of the ball felt like a connection to something bigger, a deeper part of himself that he could only access on the field. His eyes never left the screen showing the warm UPS. He was so focused that he didn't hear the man in the hoodie approach him. The stranger, who had watched Matteo from a distance, stepped closer, his footsteps soft and purposeful. Matteo didn't notice him right away, still lost in his own movements. "You're good," the man said, his voice low and calm. Matteo jumped, startled by the sudden sound. He quickly stopped his dribbling and looked up. The man in the hoodie stood in front of him, smiling slightly. There was something in his eyes that Matteo couldn't place. "Thanks," Matteo muttered, his heart racing slightly. He hadn't expected anyone to notice him, let alone compliment his skills. "You've got a good touch," the man continued, his gaze moving from Matteo's feet to his face. "You practice a lot?" Matteo nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Every day," he said, his voice filled with the certainty that only a dreamer could possess. "I want to be like Messi. I watch him every chance I get. I want to play just like him someday." The man's smile grew a little wider, as if something about Matteo's words had struck a chord. "Messi, huh," he said. "He's one of the best. You've got a long way to go, but you've got the heart for it." Matteo beamed at the compliment, even though part of him felt the sting of doubt. He had always believed in himself, but in a world where dreams seemed so far out of reach, it was hard not to wonder if he was just another kid dreaming too big. The man studied Matteo for a moment longer, then glanced back at the entrance. "You know," he said casually, "it's not every day that a kid like you gets a chance to see Messi play. Most kids would do anything to be where you are right now." Matteo's heart skipped a beat. "I know," he said, his voice softening. "But, it's not enough to just see him. I want to play like him. I want to be out there on the field." The man's eyes narrowed, as if considering something. For a moment, Matteo thought he had said the wrong thing. But then the man spoke again. "Sometimes, kid, it's not about just being on the field. It's about what you do when no one's watching. The effort you put in, even when no one else believes in you." Matteo looked up at the stranger, confused. "What do you mean?" The man smiled again, but this time it was a knowing smile. "You'll understand one day. Keep practicing. Keep pushing. You never know who's watching, or when the opportunity will come." Matteo didn't understand exactly what the man meant, but somehow, the words stuck with him. Something in the way the man spoke made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was more to this moment than he had realized. The stranger gave him a small nod, turned, and started to walk away. But before he disappeared into the crowd, he said one last thing. "Don't stop, kid. Keep dreaming." And with that, he was gone, lost in the sea of excited fans heading towards the stadium. Matteo stood there for a moment, staring after the man in the hoodie. His words echoed in his mind, and a strange feeling washed over him. It wasn't just about seeing Messi today. It wasn't even about getting close to the game. It was about something deeper. It was about the path he was walking, the work he was putting in when no one was watching. A soft noise broke his concentration, and he turned to see Carlos walking back toward him. The man in the hoodie had already disappeared into the crowd, and Matteo was left standing there alone once more. Carlos's eyes locked onto him for a moment, but instead of a harsh comment, the security guard simply nodded, as if he had noticed something in the way Matteo moved that he hadn't seen before. "5 more minutes, Carlos said, his voice softer than before. Matteo looked up at him, surprised by the change in tone. "Thanks," he said quietly. Carlos simply waved him off, then turned back toward his duties. But as he walked away, he glanced back over his shoulder. There was something about Matteo that kept nagging at him, something that he couldn't shake. The seconds ticked by, and Matteo returned to his dribbling, his mind still racing with thoughts of the man in the hoodie and the stranger's words. In the distance, he could hear the crowd's excitement growing, the cheers and roars growing louder as the players were introduced. But for Matteo, that wasn't the sound he was focused on. It was the sound of his own feet hitting the ball, each touch a reminder of his dream. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, a voice whispered to him, "Keep dreaming. Keep pushing. You never know who's watching." And in that moment, Matteo knew that this was just the beginning. The stadium was buzzing with excitement as the players were heading to the locker room for halftime. Fans were chattering, eyes glued to the screens, waiting for the second half to begin. The bright lights of the stadium made everything feel larger than life. Matteo had settled into a quiet rhythm, continuing to practice his ball control in the corner by the entrance. His eyes were still fixed on the game on the screen, but his feet didn't stop moving. Every time the ball bounced off his foot, he imagined it was the game-winning goal, his name chanted by thousands in the stands. His mind was lost in the dream, and for a moment, he forgot the world around him. But then, just as the second half approached, everything changed. The man in the hoodie who had spoken to Matteo earlier emerged from the shadows again. He wasn't alone this time. He had an assistant with him, and they both moved quickly through the crowd. Matteo didn't notice them at first, he was too caught up in his practice. Then the man in the hoodie spoke, his voice calm and steady, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "All right, Kid, he said, walking right up to Matteo. Show me what you've got. Matteo froze for a second, the ball still beneath his feet. His heart raced, a mixture of confusion and excitement bubbling up inside him. He looked up at the man, unsure of what to do. Show you what I've got. Matteo echoed, his voice trembling slightly. What do you mean? The man smiled, his eyes twinkling behind the sunglasses. I've been watching you. You've got talent. Now let's see it. Without thinking, Matteo began juggling the ball. His feet moved in a blur, each touch perfectly timed, every move flawless. The small crowd that had gathered around began to notice. Whispers ran through the air, and some people even started to pull out their phones to record the impressive display. Carlos, the veteran security guard, had been watching from a distance, trying to maintain control of the situation. He had seen a lot over the years, fans showing off their skills, kids dreaming big, but there was something different about Matteo. His moves weren't just good for a kid. They were good, period. Carlos couldn't help but stare. His gaze shifted between Matteo's fluid dribbling and the strange man who had given him the challenge. Something didn't feel right, but Carlos couldn't put his finger on it. The whole scene felt surreal, like a moment from a dream. Then, it happened. The man in the hoodie slowly reached up and pulled off his hood, followed by the sunglasses that had been hiding his face. As the crowd caught sight of his features, a collective gasp echoed through the air. It wasn't just anyone. It was Lionel Messi. The realization hit Matteo like a punch to the gut. He stopped juggling, the ball dropping to the ground as his mouth went dry. His heart raced, and his knees almost gave way beneath him. You're Messi. Matteo stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Messi grinned, that familiar smile that had graced so many of the world's greatest moments. He nodded at Matteo, his eyes filled with something between pride and amusement. I've been watching you, Matteo, he said. You remind me of myself at your age. Carlos, who had been standing in shock, finally blinked. His hands instinctively reached for his radio, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding in front of him. His mind raced, trying to process the impossible. Messi turned to Carlos, and for a brief moment, everything went still. The fans, the noise, the commotion, it all seemed to fade as Messi's voice broke through the silence. Sometimes, talent doesn't come with a ticket, he said, his words heavy with meaning. Carlos's mind whirled. He had been so focused on keeping order, so used to the rules of the stadium, that he had completely missed the truth right in front of him. This kid, this boy named Matteo, wasn't just any fan. He was a player. A hidden gem, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to be discovered. As Messi spoke, the crowd began to stir. The realization hit them all at once. They hadn't just been watching a young boy play soccer. They had been watching someone with real talent, someone who had caught the eye of one of the greatest players in the world. Phones flashed as fans began to record the moment, trying to capture the magic of what was unfolding before them. Matteo still couldn't believe it. His mind was reeling as he looked at Messi. This was the man who had inspired him, the player he had idolized for years. And now, here he was, standing right in front of him. I can't believe this, Matteo whispered, his voice filled with awe. You're really here. Watching me? Messi chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm always watching, Matteo. The best players aren't always the ones with the most tickets or the loudest voices. Sometimes, they're the ones you least expect. The ones who put in the work, day after day, even when no one is looking. The words resonated deeply within Matteo. It was like Messi had just unlocked a secret part of him. It wasn't about the fame or the stadiums. It wasn't about the crowds or the tickets. It was about passion. About dedication. About never giving up, no matter how many people doubted you. Carlos, still standing at the side, finally found his voice. But how? Why here? Why him? He gestured to Matteo, still trying to wrap his head around what he was seeing. Messi smiled again, but there was something different in his expression. It's simple, he said. I've been there. I know what it's like to be overlooked. I know what it's like to fight for a chance. Matteo's got something special. And I don't need a ticket to see that. The crowd around them was buzzing with excitement. This wasn't just a halftime moment, it was a once-in-a-lifetime encounter. Fans were whispering to each other, sharing the unbelievable story of how a young boy had just been noticed by one of the greatest footballers of all time. Matteo stood there, unable to speak, his body trembling with a mix of disbelief and joy. Messi had seen him. He had seen his skill, his passion. And more than that, Messi believed in him. With a final glance at Matteo, Messi turned to the crowd, raising his hands in the air as the cheers grew louder. It was as if he had just given everyone in the stadium a new hope, a new belief in the power of dreams. As Messi walked toward the tunnel to rejoin the players, he looked back one last time at Matteo, his smile widening. "You're on the right path, Matteo," he called over his shoulder. "Keep working hard. Your time will come." And with that, he disappeared into the tunnel, leaving Matteo standing there, still trying to absorb the incredible moment. The stadium had erupted into applause, but in that moment, Matteo felt as though the whole world had just stopped to watch him. The boy who had been ignored, the boy who had been told to leave, was now the boy who had caught the attention of Messi. And in his heart, he knew that this was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. The crowd was still cheering, but Matteo didn't hear them. All he could hear was the sound of his own heart beating, the feeling of possibility opening up before him. His dream was no longer just a dream. It was real. The noise in the stadium seemed to swell and fade like the ebb and flow of the ocean, but for Matteo, the world had gone quiet. All he could hear was the rhythmic thump of his heartbeat, each pulse a reminder that this moment was happening, that Lionel Messi had seen him. He looked around, dazed by the sudden whirlwind of activity. Fans were still cheering, their faces lit with excitement. Phones were held high, capturing every second of the magic that had unfolded. But it wasn't for the fame or the video, Matteo knew. This moment was for him. His life had just shifted in a way he couldn't quite comprehend. Behind him, the cameras were flashing, and the buzz of conversation was intensifying. The weight of his emotions, though, was heavier than anything he had ever felt. His eyes darted around the stadium, looking for the nearest exit. There were so many people around him, so many people who had witnessed this unforgettable encounter. Some people patted him on the back, congratulating him as if they had known all along what he could do. But Matteo barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind, still focused on one single thing: Lionel Messi had just told him he had talent. That Messi, the best player in the world, had acknowledged his existence. For years, Matteo had watched Messi play on TV, dreaming that one day he would be like him. But those dreams always felt so far away, so unreachable. In the dusty streets where he practiced, in the park where he honed his skills, Matteo had never imagined something like this would happen. He had never dared to believe that one of the greatest soccer players in history would come up to him and say, "I see you." For a few moments, Matteo just stood there, letting the moment settle in. The camera flashes were blinding, and his mind was spinning. But then, slowly, he crouched down and picked up his ball. He squeezed it in his hands as if trying to hold on to this incredible moment. But then reality began to creep in. Carlos, the security guard, was still there, standing off to the side, his eyes wide with disbelief. He hadn't moved since Messi had walked away. The entire situation seemed like something straight out of a dream. Carlos had seen his share of strange things over the years, but this was something else. He glanced around, trying to make sense of the surreal scene that had just unfolded. His eyes flicked to Matteo, still in the corner, and then back to the tunnel where Messi had disappeared. Carlos had been the one to tell Matteo to leave. He had been the one to dismiss him, to assume that the boy was just like all the others, nothing special. But now, looking at Matteo, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Matteo was different. And Messi had recognized it. Carlos took a slow, steady breath and started moving toward Matteo. His feet felt heavy, like he was walking through a fog. There were still people around, still fans chattering, still the buzz of excitement in the air. But for Carlos, everything felt muted. The weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him. He had pushed the boy away, treated him like just another fan, and now he realized how wrong he had been. When he reached Matteo, Carlos paused, uncertain of what to say. His words had been sharp earlier, full of authority and finality. But now, he didn't know how to apologize. What could he say to someone who had just been given an opportunity most could only dream of? "Kid," Carlos said, his voice a little softer than before. I didn't know." The words felt strange on his tongue, but they were the truth. "I was just doing my job. I didn't know who you were." Matteo looked up at him, his eyes still wide with disbelief. He didn't say anything at first, as if still processing everything that had just happened. But after a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay," Matteo said, his tone calm but heavy with the weight of everything that had just changed. "I didn't expect you to know. No one ever does." Carlos didn't know what to say to that. The words felt like they were supposed to be comforting, but in the silence that followed, they seemed inadequate. Matteo wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. In fact, he was almost understanding. It was as if, in that brief moment, the young boy had accepted everything that had happened and was ready to move forward. Carlos cleared his throat and stepped back, unsure of how to navigate the sudden shift in their dynamic. "Look," he said, glancing around, I'll let you stay. Just don't go causing a scene, all right? I'm sorry for earlier." Matteo nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said simply. There was a brief silence between them, and then Matteo turned back toward the field, his gaze fixed on the screens showing the ongoing match. His eyes glimmered with a new fire, the spark of determination rekindled in his chest. He wasn't just a kid on the sidelines anymore. Behind him, Carlos stood for a moment, still trying to come to terms with everything that had just unfolded. Messi had come to the stadium, but it wasn't for the fame or the adoration. It was for someone like Matteo. And in that moment, Carlos knew he had witnessed something bigger than any game he had ever seen. The final minutes of the match seemed to drag on, though it was clear that the fans' focus had shifted. The game was secondary now. The story of the boy who had been discovered by Messi had taken over. Cameras were still rolling, recording every second, and social media was quickly catching fire with clips of Matteo's impromptu showcase. Matteo didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the people. He just wanted to play, to keep pushing himself. He practiced his dribbling in the same corner, as if the crowd and the excitement didn't exist. He moved with purpose, his body in sync with the ball in a way that felt natural, fluid. It wasn't perfect, but he knew he was getting closer. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone told him to leave, it would be a very different story. The next morning, the world had changed for Matteo. His name was everywhere. Social media was ablaze with the footage of his incredible encounter with Lionel Messi. Clips of him juggling the ball, showing off his skills, and Messi's sudden revelation that he had been watching Matteo for some time spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, calling it one of the most heartwarming moments in recent memory, a tale of raw talent, unnoticed potential, and a chance encounter that changed a young boy's life forever. Matteo couldn't quite believe it. He had always dreamed of something like this, but now that it was happening, it felt like a dream that he was afraid to wake up from. His phone rang constantly with calls from friends, family, and even strangers congratulating him. Every notification felt like a new layer of reality settling in. He had gone from being just another kid in the crowd, an anonymous face in a sea of soccer fans, to someone people were recognizing, someone who was destined for something greater. At the same time, there was an undeniable sense of nervousness. Matteo was suddenly thrust into a spotlight he hadn't been prepared for. But even as the excitement grew, a part of him held onto the same quiet determination he had always had. His dream had always been about playing the game, not about the fame or recognition. It was about the love of the sport, the rush of the ball at his feet, the adrenaline of the match. That day, he found himself sitting in the stadium, surrounded by media, reporters, and cameras. It wasn't the usual group of spectators he was used to, those who came to cheer on their teams, but instead, he was in the midst of important people, people who had the power to change his future. He sat next to Messi, who had taken the time to make sure Matteo was introduced to the team, and he was filled with a sense of disbelief. "Just remember, Matteo," Messi said with a reassuring smile as he clapped the young boy on the back, "you've got what it takes. Just keep working hard." Matteo nodded, the words from his idol sinking in. Messi had been his hero for as long as he could remember, and now here he was, sitting beside him, learning from him. He had made it into the youth academy, an incredible opportunity sponsored by none other than Messi himself. The very academy that would give Matteo the training, exposure, and support he had only dreamed of. As the day went on, Matteo felt more and more at home. The excitement of the crowd, the buzz of the atmosphere, it all seemed so much more real now that he had been accepted into this world. He wasn't just the kid outside the stadium anymore. He had a place, a future, and most importantly, a chance to prove that his dreams were not only possible, but within reach. But as the media frenzy continued, Matteo's mind kept going back to one thing: Carlos. The man who had turned him away, the man who had doubted him. He thought about their earlier interaction, Carlos's harsh tone, the dismissal of his hopes, the assumption that he wasn't worth the time. It had stung back then, and now, as he sat in the stadium, it felt like a distant memory. But it was a memory he could never truly forget. Meanwhile, Carlos, watching from the sidelines, couldn't help but reflect on the turn of events. He had been following the story of the boy all over social media, and the reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. He saw the videos, the interviews, the photos of Matteo with Messi. The realization hit Carlos like a heavy weight. He had been wrong. He had dismissed the boy too quickly, assumed that because he didn't have a ticket, he wasn't worth his attention. He had followed the rules so strictly that he had failed to see the bigger picture. Carlos had always been a stickler for the rules. It was part of his job, part of his nature. He believed that structure and order were the cornerstones of success. But in Matteo's case, he had learned that sometimes, the rules weren't everything. Sometimes, it took a moment of human judgment to see something that couldn't be measured by tickets or passes. He hadn't seen Matteo's potential that day, he had only seen a kid breaking the rules. Now, watching Matteo's success, Carlos couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Still, it wasn't too late. Carlos decided he needed to make things right. He had a message for Matteo, and this time, it was one that came from the heart, not from his duties as a security guard. The next day, Matteo was busy with his new academy commitments, soaking in everything that was happening around him. He was surrounded by coaches, teammates, and trainers, all of them excited to work with him. The future seemed bright, and for the first time, Matteo felt like he belonged. But then, in the midst of the chaos, he spotted a familiar face. Carlos. The security guard from the stadium entrance stood awkwardly at the edge of the training field, looking uncertain. His eyes met Mateo's, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. Carlos approached, slowly, as if unsure of how to start the conversation. Mateo stopped what he was doing and looked at him, still unsure of how he felt about seeing the man who had once turned him away now standing before him, the weight of his past actions clear in his eyes. I just wanted to say something, Carlos began, his voice a little hesitant. He scratched his head, looking down at the ground before meeting Mateo's gaze. I owe you an apology. That day, I didn't see it. I didn't see what you had. I didn't see you. Mateo was quiet for a moment, letting the words sink in. He had expected this moment, had wondered if Carlos would ever come back and face him. But hearing the apology genuine and heartfelt was something he hadn't anticipated. It's okay, Mateo said after a pause. He gave Carlos a small smile, the same one he had given him the first time they had spoken. You didn't know? Carlos nodded, relief flooding his face. No. I didn't. And I was wrong. I'm sorry. There was a long pause, the kind that only came after deep understanding had passed between two people. It wasn't just an apology from Carlos, it was an acknowledgement that he had learned something. Sometimes, life handed out second chances, and Mateo's second chance had come in the form of Messi. But Carlos's second chance was in the form of seeing beyond the rules, seeing a kid who wasn't just breaking them, but using his skills to dream bigger than most ever would. Mateo looked back at the field, the excitement of the academy still fresh in his mind. I'm just doing my best, he said quietly. That's all anyone can do. Carlos smiled, his stern demeanor softening as he watched the young boy with pride. Well, it looks like your best is more than enough, he said. And in that moment, both of them knew that this wasn't just about soccer. It was about something much bigger, a lesson in empathy, understanding, and the power of second chances. Carlos had learned that sometimes, a rule wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes, it was just the beginning of something far more important. With that, Carlos turned and walked away, leaving Mateo to continue his journey. And as he did, he couldn't help but feel that the world, in all its complexity, had just taught him a valuable lesson he would never forget. As the weeks passed, Mateo's story continued to unfold. His talent was undeniable, and with each practice, each game, he grew stronger, more confident. The youth academy sponsored by Messi was just the beginning, and the world now knew his name. People came from far and wide to watch him play, to see the boy who had caught the attention of the world's greatest soccer player. But Mateo never let the fame get to his head. He stayed grounded, focused on what mattered most, the game. It was all he had ever wanted, and now, with the chance of a lifetime in front of him, he was determined to make the most of it. And in the end, that's what mattered. Not the cameras. Not the fans. Just the love for the sport, the desire to improve, and the knowledge that anything was possible, as long as you kept working and never gave up. As the final whistle blew, signaling the end of the match, Mateo stood at the edge of the field, his heart still racing from the excitement of the game. The crowd's cheers echoed in his ears, but all he could think about was how far he had come. From that moment outside the stadium, standing with nothing but a dream and a worn-out soccer ball, to now here he was, living that dream. The sun began to set over the stadium, casting a golden light that made everything feel magical. Mateo looked down at the ball in his hands, his signed ball, a gift from his idol, Lionel Messi. It was more than just a soccer ball. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for, everything he had overcome, and everything he was still striving for. He had worked hard for this moment. The late nights of practicing, the struggles, the doubts, the moments when he thought maybe he wasn't good enough, all of that had led him here. And now, standing in this beautiful stadium, surrounded by fans who cheered for him, Mateo knew that his journey was far from over. It was just beginning. A smile slowly spread across his face as he thought back to everything that had happened. He thought about the security guard, Carlos, and how, in the end, they had both learned something important. Carlos had learned that sometimes rules weren't everything. Sometimes, it was about seeing the potential in others, even when they didn't look like they belonged. Mateo had learned that even the smallest spark could catch the attention of the world's brightest stars, and that those moments could change your life forever. For Mateo, it wasn't just about playing soccer anymore. It wasn't just about the fame or the recognition. It was about the journey, the people he met along the way, the lessons he learned, and the understanding that his dreams, once so distant, were now within reach. He had seen how one kind act could alter his life, how one person, with a little faith, could change everything. He glanced up at the sky, watching as the last rays of sunlight began to fade. It was a moment of reflection. Mateo had come so far, but there was still so much more ahead of him. He wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. There were more goals to score, more challenges to face, and more lessons to learn. But now, with everything he had been given, he felt ready. Sometimes, he thought, the hardest part isn't the work you put in, but believing that you can actually make it. Believing that it's all worth it. And that moment when you realize that's when everything changes. He had dreamed of being a professional soccer player, of stepping onto the field with his heroes. But even more than that, he had dreamed of making a difference. He wanted to inspire others the way Messi had inspired him. He wanted to show kids like him that it was possible, that no matter how tough life seemed, there was always a chance if you kept going. Mateo's journey wasn't about shortcuts or magic moments, it was about perseverance, patience, and believing in himself when the world didn't always believe in him. It was about understanding that no dream was too big, no hope was too small. He had learned that, through hard work and dedication, even the impossible could start to feel within reach. And as he walked off the field, his ball tucked under his arm, Mateo felt something he hadn't felt before, a deep, quiet confidence. He had taken the first step on a path that would take him to places he had only ever dreamed of. But no matter how high he climbed, he would never forget where he came from, or the people who had helped him along the way. As the lights of the stadium flickered on, casting their bright glow over the field, Mateo knew one thing for sure: the road ahead would be long, but it would be worth it. And as long as he kept going, as long as he kept believing in his dreams, nothing was impossible. Sometimes, the world's biggest stars notice the smallest sparks. And in moments like these, the impossible feels just a little more within reach. Mateo's story was proof of that. A boy, with nothing but a ball and a dream, had been given a chance. And now, the world was his to conquer. With each step he took, with each match he played, Mateo was writing his own story, one where anything was possible, as long as you believed enough to chase it. And in the end, that belief, that quiet certainty, would carry him farther than anything else ever could.